Horrors of war. Just a quick note here. I wanted to give you a warning of graphic content ahead. With the defeat of Germany, it is going to be revealed the terrible evidence of really the evil that was the heart of the Nazi ideology of racial superiority. The evidence is going to come in the form of these concentration camps that were basically forced labor camps that would kill Jews, Gypsies, Poles, Russians, homosexuals, and so many others through overwork, starvation, and disease, as well as the death camps. This was the so-called final solution to the so-called Jewish problem in the view of the Nazis. Basically, the German army in 1941 had slaughtered hundreds of thousands of Jewish people as well as so many other civilians as they swept across all the different nations they went into. They had basically decided on the elimination of Europe's Jewish population. That was the final solution. And then after first setting up these forced labor camps, they will eventually go on to set up Auschwitz, Treblinka, and other death camps. And what is stark is not just how many people were killed, but how efficient the Germans were at exterminating about 6 million Jewish people and another 1 million Polish people, as well as Gypsies and so many others. They'd use these giant gas chambers the size of barns and then incinerate the bodies in these huge crematoriums. The evidence of this genocide, the systematic racial murder, is irrefutable. This was the Holocaust. The thing is, Americans had heard of these reports of mass murder, but hadn't initially believed them, partly because of all the inaccurate propaganda from World War I. The other thing was a lot of these forced labor camps and death camps were at the heart of German-controlled territory, which really we didn't reach until about 1945. We'll see that like United States forces, as they found certain camps, would find like thousands of bodies, as well as like around 32,000 prisoners that were near death through starvation. And Americans were not the only ones to find these. The Soviet forces are going to find specifically in like Poland, gas chambers and huge ovens that had been used to efficiently exterminate these populations, and literally the dead stacked like firewood. All of this together was the Holocaust. On the Pacific theater, we're going to see that the Allies are going to plan to try to isolate Japan from their southern conquests. So keep in mind, whereas warfare has basically ended in Europe, we have to defeat Japan as well. Japan was still tied down with China, and now Great Britain and the United States are going to move to take back their islands and so much more. We're going to see a lot of racial hatred on both sides when it comes to the Pacific War. For instance, the Americans oftentimes would depict the Japanese as like vermin or monkeys or rats, whereas the Japanese, of course, depicted themselves as the leading race, and they depicted the United States as like racial mongrels and called them demons. The thing is, both sides here frequently expected the worst from the other, and frequently both sides lived up to that expectation. The Pacific campaigns were often called island hopping Basically, the United States would control the air and let Navy and land forces isolate and capture Japanese-held islands and bypass the rest. They would destroy Japanese aircraft carriers and hundreds of planes. And basically, this would end up with the home islands of Japan being left without any kind of defensive screen against an expected invasion. On top of that, the Allied forces are really going to choke off the Japanese economy by making sure that they didn't get food, oil, and raw materials, as well as you get these heavy bombings of Japan starting in about 1944. Now, the thing is, the Allied forces had also bombed a lot of Germany, but Germany generally tended to be made up of brick buildings. Japanese cities tended to be made predominantly out of wood, which meant that they were even more vulnerable to bombings. And on top of that, Japan's air defenses were just weaker. And so, like, we get things like a firebomb raid in Tokyo, killing 124,000 people in 1945 and leaving another million homeless. And so this is specifically targeting civilian targets. It's not just about going after military targets. The other thing, though, is a lot of these bombings are particularly aimed at destroying industrial capacity. And in fact, that is exactly what they did. They destroyed about 42% of industrial capacity in Japan. And so by the time the Allies took Iwo Jima and Okinawa in 1945, Japan's position was pretty much hopeless. So beginning in 1945, there's this element of the Allies are sensing victory. And there was this hope that the Soviet Union would help in the Pacific now that warfare was really coming to an end in Europe. And Stalin did declare his intent to declare war on Japan within about 3 months of victory in Europe. However, as much as the war is going on still in the Pacific theater, you have to keep in mind what's going to happen in Europe with the after effect of war. Basically, what is decided is to divide Germany into 4 different sections. Specifically, it would be into a French section, a Great Britain section, a United States section, and a Soviet. And these would be occupational zones that, first of all, Germany is split up into, but also Berlin, the capital of Germany, is split up as well into the same 4 sections under the French, Great Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union. On top of that, having gone through warfare in Europe and having the Soviet Union fought a lot of the war on the Eastern Front, the Soviet Union is going to control much of these Eastern European countries that had helped the Germans specifically. The most the rest of the Allies could get for Stalin to agree to was basically allow the participation of non-communists in coalition governments in Eastern Europe. We're also going to see at this point the Allies are going to agree to join in a new international organization known as the UN, or the United Nations. And this foundation really had it's trying to correct the mistakes from World War I, when the United States had basically stayed aloof from the League of Nations. And all of this is going to be decided at the Yalta Conference. The thing is, April of 1945, 2 months after the Yalta Conference, FDR is going to die of a cerebral hemorrhage. At this point, Harry Truman is the new president of the United States, but his experience was much more limited. FDR hadn't even told him about the Manhattan Project, which we're going to go into a little bit more in a second. What we see at this point, though, is war is still being waged in the Pacific theater, but it's clear that the United States is going to win there, that the Allies will win. And so we get the Potsdam Declaration, which basically summarized the United States policy and gave Japan an opening to surrender. However, this declaration failed to guarantee that the emperor would not be tried as a war criminal. And so the Japanese response is basically so cautious that the United States read it as a rejection. And so this is going to bring us back to the Manhattan Project, and specifically the atomic bomb. Secretary of State James Burns is going to urge Truman to use the new atomic bomb that had literally just been tested weeks earlier against the Japanese. There was a huge fear during this time period of the Japanese fighting to the death, because there had been thousands of suicide missions by kamikaze pilots who had literally crashed their planes into United States warships. And so this is just kind of proof of the Japanese fanaticism at this time period. So there was this element of America and much of the rest of the world, and even Japan to a certain extent, knew that the Allies would defeat Japan eventually. But there was this concern that it would take another 6 to 9 months of fighting. And you have to think about how many American troops would be lost in this process. The other thing about using the atomic bomb, so on one hand, the atomic bomb would make the Japanese want to surrender much quicker. But the other thing was, give it 3 months and the Soviet Union was supposed to join in the Pacific Theater, which on one hand would help, but using the atomic bomb could manage to make the United States be able to occupy Japan without the Soviet Union's participation. And as they were already kind of having to fight off the Soviet Union, not literally, but diplomatically in Eastern Europe, there's an element of the United States and Great Britain don't really want the Soviet Union to get too involved in the Pacific Theater. So really, by the summer of 1945, the decision not to use atomic weapons was never really a serious alternative. So we're going to see the United States will drop 2 of their 3 available nuclear bombs on Japan. The first will be dropped on August 6th of 1945 in Hiroshima and kill at least 80,000 people, but would also poison thousands more with radiation that, quite frankly, America had not anticipated or known. The second atomic bomb will be dropped 3 days later, so August 9th, on Nagasaki and take another 40,000 lives. This is at the beginning of August. Japan is going to cease their hostilities and surrender formally on September 2nd. So it's another month, even after the dropping of the atomic bombs, before Japan formally surrenders. So there is, of course, always this question of, could America and the Allies have defeated Japan without resorting to the atomic bombs? Most likely, yes. How many more people would have died in the process? That is the question. And you have to think about, was it American lives that were being willing to be risked or not? But what we do know for certain is that the atomic bomb and the shock of the carnage out of it basically allowed the Emperor of Japan, as well as peace advocates in Japan, to overcome military leaders who did want to fight to the death in World War II. The question of was it worth it or not, I will leave up to you to decide for yourself. So looking at all of the different events in this video, why must we remember these events?